Dear friends and colleagues, it's my great pleasure to welcome here among us Professor Grubačić. I'm sure since you are here, you already know him, either you met with him or you heard about his work and achievements. So let me just briefly repeat what you all already know. Andrej is founding chair of the Anthropology and Social Change Department at the Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. And let me just point out that this is one of the reasons why we have invited Andrej to Prague and why we are so happy to have him here, because in our previous research grant, we focused on phenomenology of social change. So it was one of our topics that we were interested in, and since there is already a whole department that specializes in social change, it's just great opportunity to have Andrej here. The second reason why I'm so happy that Andrej is here with us is his book, Living at the Edges of Capitalism. Because in this book he deals with the concept and phenomenon of mutual aid. And this concept is closely related to our ongoing research project that is focused on new approaches to the ontology of social cohesion. And our main ambition was precisely to contest and problematize the mainstream sociological approaches to social cohesion and develop something more sexy, more interesting, that would go along the lines of anarchist ethics and anarchist concept of mutual aid. Quite recently, together with Dan, Petr Urban and Catherine Malabou, we have prepared a volume Unchaining Solidarity on Mutual Aid and Anarchism with Catherine Malabou. So this is a topic that really means a lot for us, and I just can't wait to hear something more about it from Andrej, and I presume the same goes for you. So this is the right time for me to stop talking and let Andrej do what we are here all for. So please, Andrej.
Thank you, Petr, and thank you all for the invitation. And if I'm not speaking loud enough, please let me know. My voice is still a little bit cracked from a recent cold, thankfully not COVID. And welcome to all of you who are on Zoom, whom I can barely see. There is a little bit of a panopticon here, feel surveilled. But it is actually a very sentimental thing for me to be here, as I was conveying to Petr. My late grandfather, Konstantin, defended his PhD in philosophy here in Prague at Charles University, at the Czech part of the Charles University in 1937. And he proceeded to go to Yugoslavia, which then became Socialist Yugoslavia, became a communist dissident, ended up in a gulag, was tortured to death, and unfortunately I never got to meet him. I met my grandmother, however, his wife, who got a PhD in linguistics, so she can support the family, the usual Eastern European intellectual story. And she was a communist before the war, she remained a communist after the war, Emilia. And I remember asking Mama, I used to call her Emilia, if she's still a communist. And she told me something, I was very young, that completely surprised me and stunned me in a certain sense. She told me, yes, I am, and I will be a communist until the rest of my days. However, being a communist doesn't mean that we, my generation, her generation, has chosen the right path. The right path is something that we made a mistake. We have chosen the wrong one. It's up to your generation to find a different way to communism. And this kind of haunted me ever since, finding a different path to communism. How? My other grandmother, maternal grandmother, Tanya, gave me, before going to the university, gave me a beautiful gift. Book by Herzen, My Past and Thoughts, I think is the translation in English, I read it in Yugoslav. And it was a book that made me decide to become a historian. It was a beautiful book, I'm sure you're familiar with it, that recounts the history of Russian exiles, dissidents in the 19th century. So I said, yes, I want to become a historian, and so I did. However, I was a historian in a very hostile environment. It was the end of Yugoslavia, we were bombed, by say we, I mean former Yugoslavs, in what was a terrible ethnic war that all of you are familiar with. And I was trying to make sense against, let's call them the worshippers of the state, both from the left and from the right. People who were on one hand Western neoliberal modernizers, on the other hand ethno-nationalist, atavistic historians, who were making my time at the University of Belgrade rather miserable. So in that rather miserable environment, I stumbled upon Petr Piotr Kropotkin, and one of his most beautiful books, which is Mutual Aid. There was one paragraph that I was reading that completely changed the way that I think about history and social sciences. And this is the one that I want to share with you. Kropotkin here offers a suggestion, which is to all the existentially confused radical scholars, such as myself, and that is to restore the real proportion between conflict and solidarity. Now, this might sound obscure, but he clarifies. He says that radical scholars are bound to enter a minute analysis of the thousands of facts and faint indications accidentally preserved in the relics of the past, to interpret them with the aid of contemporary ethnology, and, after having heard so much about what used to divide men, to reconstruct stone by stone the institutions which used to unite them. Now, this, reconstructing stone by stone institutions which used to unite people, restoring this balance between conflict and solidarity, became the crux of my own intellectual project. And I can't really bring to life vividly enough just how excited I was, intellectually exhilarated, in this terrible environment of Belgrade during the 90s, reading these words. Now, what are these practices? What is this thing, this process that Kropotkin is referring to? Well, he calls it mutual aid. And I think that there is this famous passage which really deserves to be quoted in full, where Kropotkin, page 12 in my edition, says, "It is not love, and not even sympathy, understood in its proper sense, which induces a herd of horses to form a ring in order to resist the attack of wolves. It is not love which induces wolves to form a pack for hunting. It is not love which induces kittens to play, or a dozen of species of young birds to spend their days together in the autumn. And it is neither love nor personal sympathy which induces many deer scattered over a territory as large as France to form into a score of separate herds marching to a given spot. It is a feeling infinitely wider than love or personal sympathy, an instinct that has been slowly developed among animals and men in the course of an extremely long evolution, in which has taught animals and men alike the force they can borrow from the practice of mutual aid and support, and the joys that they can find in social life. It is not love and not even sympathy upon which society is based. It is the conscience, be it only at the stage of an instinct, of human solidarity. It is the unconscious recognition of the force that is borrowed by each man from the practice of mutual aid, of the close dependence of everyone's happiness upon the happiness of all. and the sense of justice or equity which brings the individual to consider the rights of every other individual as equal to his own. Upon this broad and necessary foundation, the still higher moral feelings are developed. Mutual aid, then, is the core of human sociability. Mutual aid is what society is based on. Now, this was not particularly original. Kropotkin acknowledges as much. In 1909, he writes, Kessler, Severtsov, Menzbir, Brandt, 4 great Russian zoologists, and a 5th lesser one, Polyakov, and finally myself, a simple traveler, see a great deal of mutual aid where Darwin and Wallace see only struggle. Namely, in Russia, in these days, there was a school of naturalists, and this is not explored enough at Harvard. There is a wonderful scholar working on exactly these issues by the name of Anya Bernstein, working on a book on this topic, which is about the reception of Darwin in Russia, which was a very excited one. People agreed with Darwin or disagreed with Darwin, but there was an excitement that actually was not paralleled by the one in Britain or in France. And Russia developed something of a school, natural school, based on mutual aid as a response to Darwin. And the first, thanks to Anya Bernstein, the first quote that I was able to find, the first mention of mutual aid, comes from a soil scientist, actually a man who is credited by inventing soil sciences altogether, and that is Vasil Dokuchaev, who died in 1903. And he writes, there is not only a single law in the world, that of Darwin, the law of the struggle for existence, but there is also the opposite one, the law of love, of cooperation, and of mutual aid, which is especially clear in the existence of our zones, both those of soil and the natural historical ones. When he speaks about zones, he's speaking about zonality, it is his concept, the existence of global soil zones, taiga, forests, steppes, tropics, that are horizontally and vertically organized. He did a lot of research across Eurasia, and in late 1880s, he, and this is very interesting, Dokuchaev, theorized soil as an independent entity that is produced through mutual aid and collaboration. Actually, collaboration of 5 factors: climate, living organisms, parent rock, age, relief. In a sense, soil is neither dead matter nor alive, but a product of mutual aid and collaboration between organic and inorganic agents. Be it as it may, this notion of mutual aid came to the center of Russian intellectual interest in those days, and Kropotkin summarized it thusly. We ask nature, who are the fittest, those who continually at war with each other, or those who support one another? We at once see that those animals which require habits of mutual aid are undoubtedly the fittest. They have more chances to survive, and they attain, in their respective classes, the highest development of intelligence and bodily organization. Now, what was Kropotkin's achievement? And it was a tremendous one, was to move this conversation from biology to human society, and to create something that they call Kropotkin's double movement, which is to say that at each stage of human development, from the earliest clans to proto-states, to towns, to capitalist states and forms of organization and regulation, new forms of social regulation and organizations were imposed from above. But at the same time, as an antidote of sorts, forms of mutual aid appeared from below. So the central conflict of human history, Kropotkin says, is the conflict between institutions of possessive individualism and institutions of mutual aid. And that, I think, is something that is altogether an incredible contribution of Kropotkin to social sciences and especially to history. Now, he proceeds to say something interesting. He says, the autonomous life, never crushed by state, never crushed by capitalism, survived, and this is an intriguing notion and concept, in vibrant interstices. And these vibrant interstices are spaces that are not completely touched, contaminated, constrained by capitalism and the state. Our task is to understand the logic of these vibrant interstices. It's a paraphrase. And it's an interesting thing because Kropotkin really invites us to think about a comparative study, if you will, of these spaces of concentrated mutual aid that to some extent maintain a distance from capital and from the state, from the processes of valorization and processes of state regulation. Now, what is so fascinating to me is that nobody has taken up Kropotkin outside of the anarchist circle on this proposal. And it was only in the 1970s, and anthropologists among you will recognize this name immediately, that a sort of a misbehaving student of Claude Lévi-Strauss, whose name was Pierre Clastre, took it upon himself to start developing these insights in the book called Societies Against the State. Now this book, which is a sort of an underground classic, a wonderful book, begins with a fascinating quotation, a fascinating paragraph. He says, it has been said that the history of people with history is a history of class struggle. And it can be said with at least as much truthfulness that the history of people without history is a history of their struggle against the state. And he proceeds to say something phenomenally interesting, which is that there is a distinction between coercive power and between non-coercive power, and that people living without a state actually organize institutions with a particular intention of discouraging any kind of state-like appearance, of any kind of state-like structures. So the society was organized in order to discourage the formation of internal state-like hierarchies. Now, what he did not explain, and this was unfortunate, is how were these people without a state, these societies without a state, which inspired Deleuze and Guattari and many other French philosophers later. But how do they know what to organize against if they have never experienced the state? One of Clastres' students, not directly, but let's say disciples, is American anthropologist James C. Scott, who in 2009 took up on himself to try to solve this mystery. And his result of his study was this wonderful book called The Art of Not Being Governed, the anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia. And the central thing that he's writing about in this book really is the notion of zomia, the space of zomia. And I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, with this geographical place, location, which is above Thailand, Burma, and many other places, encompassing millions of people, living in what Scott claims is the standard human condition without a state. And he identifies something in zomia, but also more broadly, something that he calls a standard human condition project of people who live without a state because they have made a decision to live without the state, because they have actually experienced the state and they became refugees, later self-styled barbarians by design and choice, sedentary in order, as former state subjects, in order to create societies that are egalitarian to a degree, but always free from the coercion of the state. And he creates this new concept. It's not societies against the state, it's non-state societies. Sometimes he refers to them as refuge zones or zones of refuge. Other times he calls them shutter zones, spaces of bewildering linguistic and ethnic complexity that exist in a way to discourage the state from ever appearing in their midst. Now, his greatest contribution, I believe, is the notion that they have organized escape social structures, and he names 5. The first escape social structure is the one of space. He calls it the friction of space or territory, which basically means that they had to escape somewhere which was going to be far, to inaccessible spaces and places like mountains, lakes, swamps in the United States, many different places, of course hills in zomia, where the state cannot reach them, beyond the reach of the state. As Scott says, civilizations don't climb hills, they don't jump over mountains. This is where people hide. The second escape social structure would be the one of agriculture. Their escape crops, he says, maize, for example, or cassava in the Americas, spaces that, or crops that people use in order to avoid agriculture to be co-opted by the state. The third one that he mentions is political decentralization. All of these spaces are politically completely decentralized. They're political units, they are very prone to dispersal, which means that they are able to, again, resist incorporation into the state. Then he mentions something that he takes from Cluster, which is the idea of formality, illiteracy. People without history choose not to have written history because they choose to hide. They choose to exist in a way that is not going to be codified or incorporated into the state. And same goes for their choice not to have ethnicity. These are, again, groups of very different cultural backgrounds, very different ethnicities. They're choosing to be defined, what anthropologists call open aggregation, in the principle that actually does not allow for ethnic definition or identification. Finally, he mentions rebellious cosmology that these people have as an escape social structure. But then he comes to a really disappointing conclusion. Scott all of a sudden ends this beautiful book on 500 and something pages, and he says, well, that was then. Now we don't have that anymore. Non-state people have been defeated, non-state spaces have been enclosed. He's using the term enclosure, which is interesting. We now live in this global administered space where states became so big, they have completely demolished this technology with new technologies, this friction of distance. And now all of these people, non-state people, previously non-state people, have been brought to the heel in this global administered state space that we live in now. And I remember reading this and thinking, wow, I mean, 400 pages of absolutely wonderful writing in order to come to these terribly pessimistic conclusions. Why? And I wasn't the only one who was asking this. Another person who was asking this, and also in dialogue with Scott, was Raul Zibecki. I don't know if this name is familiar here in Prague. He's a Latin American social scientist, journalist, originally from Uruguay. He wrote a book about the dispersed spaces, and he made a sort of Scott, an argument that basically people live today in non-state spaces, asimientos, in spaces that are product of neoliberalism in Latin America, which is his topic, his space, his geography. He writes about people who have escaped capitalist relations of production, state processes of regulation and control and surveillance, and have actually escaped into, say, El Alto. 70% of production there is independent production, non-remunerated, avoiding the rhythms of capital, of division of labor, and staying, and he says, and I will explain why I think that he overstates his case, that they are completely outside of capitalism, completely outside of the formal market economy, and that they live a space, dispersed space of complete autonomy. Now, it's an interesting idea, and it's an interesting proposal. To which another person, another anthropologist, also a student of Scott, whose name is Obika Gray, now from Jamaica, added another wrinkle, theoretical intellectual wrinkle, which is the post-colonial one. He's writing from Jamaica. And he says, well, yes, all this is true, but what do we do with people who are not completely outside of the state? And he comes up with this very tantalizing concept of exilic space, which I have borrowed from him. And basically he says in Jamaica we have spaces of urban poor. And these spaces have this sort of parasitic relationship, very strategic relationship to the state. They are inferior urban space, he calls them. They are spaces in which people like tenement yards, if you like reggae music, if you like dub, you will know what I mean. These are the spaces where people go, when they gather, when they dance, when they produce what is called the rude indisciplinarity, the rude boy way of life, at the margins of capitalist, again, state relations. Not completely separated from the state in the middle of Jamaica, Kingston and other places, but separate enough to have their own identity, to have their own ecology, to have their own culture in which they recover from processes, he calls it, of cultural humiliation. In these processes and culture of mixed borrowings from American, British culture and so forth, and ideas of black power, Rastafarianism and so forth. So these exilic spaces exist both within the state, they are not outside of the state. State intrudes, state surveils. He believes in this notion and defends this notion of predatory colonial state. And this is done in a way that is strategic. But they do escape, that's why they're exilic, they do escape to an extent the logic of state and logic of capitalism. These are the exilic spaces. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that many of these insights, all of these insights are phenomenal, interesting, original, and new. But if you think about Scott, if you think about Cluster, they don't mention capitalism at all. There's not a single mention of capitalism in Scott. There's very little mention of capitalism in, say, Cluster. Even Obika Gray speaks mostly about the predatory parasitic state trying to use state theory in order to explain what happens to the state in the periphery or in the colonial world. So they're not talking about capitalism. Zibeki, on the other hand, doesn't talk about history. For him, we are dealing with a new world, neoliberal world, that creates new relationships between states, new relationship between territories, new relationship between states and the people. So he's not talking about something that is historically endemic to capitalism. He's talking about something that is a result of something that's fairly new. Not something that exists in the long durée of historical capitalism, but something that is created through the neoliberal shock. That, I think, is a problem. So if you think about all of this, if you go, say, for example, to Scott and his conceptualization of state, well, we have the state that is completely divorced from any world systemic historical capitalist processes of the formation of capitalist world economy. We have a state as a regional entity that is just growing, becoming bigger, developing distance, demolishing technologies, becoming more and more powerful, eventually swallowing up, like Boa, the snake, swallowing up non-state spaces, but completely divorced from any processes of enclosure, from any actual concepts and processes of historical capitalism. And that, I think, is a big problem. And I was struggling with this a lot. How do we then think about this? And as a good Braudelian, follower of Fernand Braudel, I discovered, or went back, to something that Braudel wrote about early, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this concept, the idea of economy being organized on 3 floors, like a tree. And the second floor is the floor of what he calls economy proper. This is where markets live, this is the market society, this is where horizontal networks that connect different markets exist. Then there is the third floor, and the third floor is the floor of capitalism. He calls it the law of jungle. This is where great animals, great predators live. This is from 16th century, the home of real capitalism, which is against the market. And then, and this is the most interesting part, at least for me, there is the lowest stratum, he says, of non-economy. He calls it material life. And material life is this great soil on which all of the economic edifice, tree, exists. And it is the soil in which capitalism is always trying to thrust itself, to penetrate, but never completely. Capitalism is never completely successful in colonizing, Braudel thinks, the material life, this large stratum of non-economy. And then, maybe a few pages later in the same book, he has a footnote in which he talks about black holes in capitalist world economy. And he says, well, they exist. They're places that are completely structured and self-organized outside of the commercial market, formal economy, and commercial exchange. They're usually in the mountains, or in the jungles, or in the hills, or in the swamps, away from civilization. And they do exist, but it's almost impossible, Braudel thinks, to study them, because whomever goes there to study will be very disappointed, he says, by the paucity of evidence. And I think that he's wrong. But of course you can see where I'm going with this. Kropotkin's vibrant interstices and Braudel's black holes in capitalist world economy. And of course the very notion of material life as a sort of a life world in which mutual aid exists in a way, before capitalism and the state and the rise of capitalism and the state restricted the meaning of production. Now, this to me is something that pushed me to a different way of thinking about this. How can we study, in disagreement with Braudel, that this is unstudiable, these processes and these spaces of mutual aid? What a social scientist or historian needs in order to understand this? And my first instinct was to say a different understanding of economy. What is non-economy that Braudel talks about? And this is interesting because the first reference usually is Polanyi. You usually think about, if you want to talk about outside activities, economic activities, outside of the formal exchange, outside of the market, you usually speak about substantive activities. Polanyi speaks about mainstream economics, he calls it formal economy. This is about economizing, about distribution of very scarce resources through self-regulating markets. They are themselves, Polanyi insists, very imperfect conditions, manipulated by the states, but also by corporations and other economic actors. And you're probably familiar with all of this. But there are also substantive activities, and he speaks about redistribution, he speaks about reciprocity, he speaks about householding, which are outside of the formal world of economics. And they are substantive practices of self-provisioning. And they could be the home of these practices of mutual aid. Now, it's quite possible, but I actually think very unlikely. And this is where Kropotkin again comes to help. There is something very utilitarian about the substantivist vision of the world and economy. And I went back to mutual aid, and I reread another passage that was a favorite passage of my late friend David Graeber, who loved to think about play and creativity, and who would always say, read Kropotkin about play. And so I did. And I found this beautiful paragraph in the book. We know at the present time that all animals, beginning with the ants, going on to the birds, and ending with the highest mammals, are fond of plays, wrestling, running after each other, trying to capture each other, teasing each other, and so on. And while many plays are, so to speak, a school for the proper behavior of the young in mature life, there are others which, apart from their utilitarian purposes, are together with dancing and singing, mere manifestations of excess of forces, the joy of life, he says, and the desire to communicate in some way or another with other individuals of the same or other species. In short, a manifestation of sociability proper, which is a distinctive feature of all the animal world, play. And that, I think, leads us to a very different understanding of economy. And I think that we should understand the Braudelian non-economy, material life, as a production of communal bonds, of joy, communal life, production of life itself. And the support for this I have discovered in the work of Terence Turner was an anthropologist from Cornell and later Chicago, who wrote beautifully about economy from a slightly different perspective. And he writes in one of his most famous books, to understand economy in its widest sense, we should better start from Marx and Engels' programmatic anthropological definition of production in the German ideology, in which production is said to comprehend not merely the production of the means of sustenance, but of human beings and families, social relations of cooperation, and new needs as well. Commodity production narrows the range of activities that count as productive to those that form part of the economy, what produces value, while separating the other forms of productive activity from production, and a fortiori from those considered to be producers. Production in many pre-capitalist societies included all things that were valued, in the sense that people were willing to expend their energies and times in doing or making them. Often they were given away. Perhaps most importantly, in many societies, people expend most energy not on sustenance, but on socialization or production of human relations as well as things. This has influenced David Graeber to a great extent, and when he wrote about human economies in his book, beautiful book, that first 5,000 years, I think is the name, and the most recent one, The Dawn of Everything. But also Barbara Ehrenreich, who some of you might know as American journalist and social theorist, who wrote one of my favorite books, Dancing in the Street. And she writes about dancing, and she says, before people had written language or settled into villages, they saw dancing as important enough to record on the stone. Evidence from neurological sciences indicates that music together with dance have co-evolved biologically and culturally to serve as a technology of social bonding. Findings of anthropologists and psychiatrists show how the rhythmic behavioral activities that are induced by drum beats and music can lead to altered states of consciousness through which mutual aid among members of societies is engendered. Now, civilized people, Ehrenreich continued, often stereotype indigenous people as lazy or incensed by easy crops that enable natives to expend efforts on cultural rituals and play rather than on work. For these reasons, says Ehrenreich, they launched a global campaign against festivities and ecstatic rituals. She continues, at some point, in town after town, throughout the northern Christian world, the music stops. Carnival costumes are put away or sold. Dramas that once engaged town's entire population are cancelled. Festive rituals are forgotten or preserved only in tame and truncated form. The ecstatic possibility, which had first been driven from the sacred precincts of the church, was now hurried away from the streets and public squares. This is, of course, Norbert Elias and his civilizing process. Along with the end of public joy comes what she calls epidemic of melancholy, first in 7th century England, then 18th century Germany, and then as an endemic throughout the Western world. So, far from utilitarianism, outside of capitalism, in the spaces of mutual aid, of concentrated mutual aid, spaces that escape state to an extent, escape capitalism to an extent, once sustenance is achieved, the center of economy moves to the production of community and often through collective joy. What we call development should then, I think more precisely, be defined as the replacement of communal joy by commodity production. Now, this is one thing, and this was one strand that helped me think through these problems. The other one was how to situate the processes of mutual aid in a way that would help us understand how capitalism works. How do we see and how do we think about these processes from the perspective of world capitalism? Braudel is again helpful. He speaks about something that he calls the world time. World time is one of the essential concepts for Braudel. And it means this contradictory totality of temporal and spatial scales of the capitalist world economy since the 16th century, a thought further developed by my late mentor, Immanuel Wallerstein, who wrote about a capitalist modern world economy, a modern world system, an interstate system that was created in order to promote the law of value, to push against the producers, direct producers, to organize an interstate. It's not an assemblage, it's an ordered organization of states that actually exist in order to intensify and incorporate, he used to say. Intensify capitalist production where it exists and incorporate new zones, new regions into the capitalist world economy. And incorporation is a central concept because incorporation for him means making what is internal, what is external, internal, which means transforming, first of all the productive activities in the new zone into something that can be incorporated into the worldwide division of labor, but also transforming all the political activities, directly democratic activities very often, into the political system of the state, which cannot be too strong, because that would obstruct the flow of commodities, nor too weak for the very same reason. So we have core, we have periphery, and somewhere in between we have what Czech Republic is today, which is semi-periphery. Now, incorporation is a very interesting concept, and I think that it helps us, together with this whole analysis, think about how capitalism actually works, and it also, where Immanuel was very and Giovanni Arrighi, who also wrote together with him, was very interesting notion of hegemonic powers. Namely, because economy is not even, and there are many downturns, many forms of restructuring. These restructurings of capitalist world economy usually means that there are hegemonic powers that come one after another. The first one was Holland, then there was England, and finally we have the United States. Each one of these has its own global production regime, each one of these has its own formal version of imperialism, and each one of these goes into the processes of rise and decline. And I believe, as Emmanuel did, that right now the United States is in the process of terminal decline as a hegemonic power in the capitalist world economy. But be that as it may, the third problem in researching these processes of vibrant interstices or black holes or whatever you want to call them, spaces of concentrated mutual aid, is how do we do that as social scientists? How do we study it? And this is where I learned a lot from Albert Hirschman, economist who was teaching at Princeton, who is always a sort of enfant terrible of economy, who was always struggling with the idea that economy is actually a science, and who wrote a book called Exit, Voice and Loyalty. He used to say, I like to plant a small idea and then watch it grow, and he really did. He started with decline of companies, and he ended with the explanation of the American frontier. So Exit, Voice and Loyalty, I don't know if you're familiar with the book, means basically when the firm or company is in some kind of trouble, you can do three things. You can either stay loyal, you can exit or leave the firm, or you can become a dissident and use your voice to voice your dissent. So I think that we can actually combine this in an interesting way with what escape social structures that Scott was talking about are. And that can give us tools to actually study these spaces in a way that I don't think Hirschman actually expected. He was thinking about these things as distinctive strategic choices. I think that are complementary protective strategies. Namely, exit could signify all of those escape social structures that James Scott wrote about. Voice could also mean the dissidents, but also open rebellion, war, anything that you need to do in order to protect the space, autonomous space, black hole, vibrant interstices that you have created. And finally, loyalty usually means a strategic dependence on either the state or extra-state space or an actor. So with this in hand, with these conceptual, historical tools in hand, I think that we can actually try to understand how to study black holes, vibrant interstices, and processes of mutual aid. My own ethnography took me to many different places in which I have tried to, or ethnographic work, in which I have tried to actually study that and do just that. And the most interesting thing about this was discovery of loyalty as a strategy, as a strategic consideration, spaces that are outside of the state. And if you think about these black holes, they are self-organized spaces outside of the processes of capitalism and the state that somehow have to survive. Think about Kouba as a state space, but also think about pretty much anybody else. Maroons, for example, in Jamaica. In order to survive, they have to strike a loyalty bargain with the state. And that loyalty bargain is a risky business, because you can be incorporated and that loyalty bargain can be renegotiated. Take Maroons from Jamaica. They struck their loyalty bargain with the plantation society. And what happened to them was basically they were allowed to exist, but at a terrible price. Whomever would flee the plantation after that was captured by the Maroons themselves and delivered back to the plantation. That was the price of the bargain. Peter Limbaugh and Marcus Rediker wrote about pirate ships, and pirate ships had to make a strike, a very interesting and very similar bargain, namely with the English state. You're allowed to raid ships, but you're allowed to raid only the enemy ships of the British Empire. And finally, the people with whom I did most of my ethnographic work with are the Russian Cossacks. And the reason I was attracted to Russian Cossacks by the River of Dawn was because they were a classic example of a non-state space, a non-state people. They were emerged in 15th, mostly 16th centuries as a non-state space, created in opposition to rising Russian state, Muscovy, and they have created a space of direct democracy based on herding, based on raiding. There were also land pirates, but definitely not on agriculture, which was forbidden. There was no private property. There was direct democracy around the notion of krug, circle, assembly, that was facilitated by ataman, who had no power but power of persuasion, just like Cluster's chief, had non-coercive power, but none of the elements of the coercive power. And then this directly democratic society, completely neglected, unfortunately, by many Russian historians, suddenly, in the 18th century, almost inexplicably, becomes destroyed. Commons were privatized, the direct democracy was destroyed, ataman becomes actually the chief, and the Cossacks themselves become more Russians than the Russians themselves. And right now, you probably have read about the Cossacks chasing members of Pussy Riot around Russia, and right now taking part in the invasion of Ukraine. So how does this happen? How does this intellectual privatization of non-state peoples whose life was organized around notions of mutual aid and practices of mutual aid and lived non-economy, how does this happen? Well, if you think about from the world systems perspective, from the perspective of capitalism, the answer is very simple. In 18th century, there is the process of incorporation of Russia during the hegemonic shift from Holland to Britain into the capitalist world economy. Russia was transformed into what was called the breadbasket of Europe. There was a tremendous pressure that the Russian state exercised on the Cossacks to remove them from basically raiding to herding and back to agriculture. All of a sudden, the Cossack society becomes destroyed, completely in its autonomous sense, completely deprived of any relationships of mutual aid, and incorporated into the Russian state, and incorporated into the capitalist world economy. So, Russian state, the reason why this happened, of course, was because Cossack society was also based, their agreement with the Russian state was also based on the loyalty bargain. They were creating and protecting the southern frontier of Russia from the Tatars in exchange for what was called bashrovka, which meant annual subsidy. They would receive money, they would receive guns, they would receive vegetables and many other things. And then, of course, that was renegotiated, and of course, that was the end of the Cossacks as a black hole or as a vibrant interests that exist outside of capitalism. Now, my next field site took me to a very different place, contemporary place called Chiapas, where the Zapatistas, the indigenous army society, exist in many ways similarly to the one of the Cossacks, with some very instructive differences. Cossacks had bargaining power. Cossacks were able to actually defend the frontiers of Russian state. In this process that I call dual sovereignty, they were able to build the Russian state while at the same time building their own black hole, their own vibrant interstices, their own exilic space. Now, Zapatistas, meaning indigenous Mexicans, had nothing of the sort. They had no bargaining power whatsoever. They were not valuable, they were forgotten. Olvidos, they called themselves the forgotten ones. State had absolutely no use for them, which then made them strategically dependent, not on the Mexican state, but on the international and national civil society. So the Zapatistas have struck the loyalty bargain with the international and national Mexican civil society, which they rather masterfully were able to change and to renegotiate so far to their advantage. This doesn't take them completely outside of capitalism. In my work with the Zapatistas, I was able to observe that most of the things that are produced, even though the surplus is socialized and collectivized, actually does participate in the world economy. It does its trade through what is called solidarity economy on the world market. And it is not completely free of capitalism. I came to call this contradictory substantive practices, which are to some extent against capital and in some to some extent supportive of capital. They have this contradictory location that is both inside of the state and inside of the system, and outside of the state and outside of the system. But nevertheless, the processes of mutual aid, the institutions of non-economy, all the elements of what Kropotkin would call vibrant interests are there, are present. And Mexican Zapatistas are also very much aware, like we are in former Eastern Europe, that you cannot build socialism in one country, that you cannot create mutual aid only in one space. And therefore, they have this strategic orientation that they call the other campaign, that has been redefined ever since, of moving the center of Zapatismo further and further away from Chiapas and bringing it even to Europe last year when there was a big Zapatista caravan. The third place that I've studied is the place of Rojava, the Kurdish society in northern eastern Syria, where there is absolutely fascinating strategic dependence on not one state but three, on Russia, on the United States, and on Assad Syria, which is being changed throughout. But there is something else, which is the process of dual sovereignty, quite different than the one that existed with the Cossacks. Namely, the same group of people, Kurdish revolutionaries, who are organizing society in Rojava, have created two political systems. One is the political system of council democracy, of direct democracy, of Soviets, if you will, of neighborhoods, of communes, of regional federations, which actually really governs the society. And the other is something that is called autonomous administration, which is the group of people and institutions that actually resembles the state, that has a parliament, that has something similar to prime minister, that has an assembly, that has a lawmaking procedure, everything that you would usually associate with the state. The interesting thing is, this is not dual power, because these are not two opposing structures. The same group of people builds and participate in both of these structures. And when I would ask them, why are you doing this? They would say, well, people want and need to talk to states. So we have to pretend that we are one. We have to create an interface that is going to see, speak, and talk like a state, negotiate like a state, while we are actually going to use this other thing, the council democracy, direct democracy, they call it democratic confederalism, in order to actually govern the society. How long is this tension going to be maintained? I don't know. It's fraught with dangers, but it's exceptionally interesting. And I think gives us a good idea of how the society that is transitioning in the form of social revolution can actually break with those relationships. So I was speaking until now about different ways in which we can actually see vibrant interstices, processes of mutual aid from the perspective of capitalism and historical capitalism. But I want to say something that I think is equally important, and as Braudel would say, turn the hourglass upside down and see what capitalism actually looks like if we think about it from the perspective of mutual aid. And that, I think, is the intellectual project that we should do well if we would to focus on. Because so far, the attempt to put mutual aid back, as Petr probably knows, at the center of philosophical thinking, of historical social science and so forth, anthropology, has been rather unsuccessful and sporadic. But what would it actually mean if we were to take and begin with mutual aid, and then to think about the development of capitalism from the perspective of mutual aid? Would it change anything? And I think it would change a lot. If we go back to that Cluster's aphorism, which is that people without history, their history is a struggle against the state, I think that we can actually say that the history of capitalism is a history of struggle against processes and institutions of mutual aid. We can go back to Kropotkin's notion that the history, and not just history, but history of capitalism, is struggle against the institutions of mutual aid. Mutual aid consists of the flow of cooperative relations that are produced at the edges of state and capitalism as part of what Braudel called, as I mentioned, material life. It is in these processes of material life, historically and systematically ignored, that we actually find social capacity to challenge and occasionally break capitalist relations. This we can call Kropotkinian inversion. Capitalist accumulation and appropriation is an ongoing struggle against the flow of cooperative activities that resist it and that promotes the vital collective capacity that capital cannot overcome. So if we put mutual aid at the center of our historical analysis of capitalism, we are able to show how capitalism, defined as a historical system predicated on endless accumulation, never completely imprisons life. We see the instability of processes of accumulation and incorporation that are a direct result of the way that processes and practices of mutual aid insert themselves into the logic of capitalism. We observe the processes of accumulation, separation, all of these violent processes of capitalism that are situated, but also the spaces of concentrated mutual aid that are situated beyond these violent processes and that coexist contradictorily with capitalist social relations, and they have capacity to escape the capitalist sphere of value production. I call this Vulcanization, the process of, forgive me, I am from the Balkans, so Vulcanization is the process that is endemic to capitalism. That means this breaking from the systemic processes of capitalism and the state, production and then circulation of these processes of mutual aid that stand at distance from processes of capitalism and in antagonistic relationship with the capitalist organization, hierarchical organization of capitalist world economy and capitalist modernity. And I think that if we keep, or instead of keeping, an exclusive focus, as Marxists often do, on people and nature as only labor force, and if we don't center our analysis on antagonisms and contradictions that destroy social life, we can rethink capitalism from the perspective of mutual aid, which would provide us with a key to understanding the possibilities of social transformation through the dissolution, erosion, or even overcoming the relation of capital. Now, to put this slightly more scandalously, Kropotkin said that there is no society without mutual aid. And I will also say there is no capitalism without mutual aid. But this is not a reason for desperation. That's actually a reason for hope and optimism. Capitalism, in many ways, is, in every possible way, is parasitic on relationships of mutual aid and communistic cooperation. This is the communism that capitalism does not acknowledge. It is communism, mutual aid, that is not an abstract, distant ideal, impossible to maintain, but a lived practical reality that we all engage in daily to different degrees. And it exists, even subversively, in all sorts of ways, in a way that makes capitalism both possible and very difficult to maintain. It has been very fashionable lately by Negri and many others to say that capitalism has entered a new phase in which it has become parasitical of forms of cooperative or of creative cooperation, and largely on the internet. And I think this is nonsense, because this is what capitalism has always been. Capitalism in itself has always been completely dependent on relations of mutual aid, and this is an extremely interesting research project. For some reasons, almost no one is interested in carrying this research project out. Instead of examining how the relations of hierarchy and exploitation are reproduced, refused, and entangled with relations of capital, mutual aid, and care, how relations of care become continuous with relations of violence, but nonetheless hold together systems of violence so they don't entirely fall apart. Both traditional Marxism and contemporary social theory have stubbornly dismissed pretty much anything suggestive of generosity, cooperation, or altruism as some kind of a bourgeois illusion. These are all framed as critiques, but if all that you are willing to talk about is that which you claim to stand against, if you can imagine, that you can imagine is what you claim to stand against, then in what sense do you actually stand against it? Sometimes it seems that academic left theory, not only the postmodern one, but theory in general, including Marxism, has ended up gradually internalizing and reproducing one of the most distressing aspects of the neoliberal economism, that it claims to oppose. Now, activists here, I think, are ahead of the theorists. Things have moved on. I already mentioned the Democratic Federation of Northeast Syria, Rojava, which was profoundly influenced by Kropotkin and his writings about social ecology and cooperative federalism, in part through the works of social ecologist Murray Bookchin, in part by going back to source, to Kropotkin, and in large part too by drawing on their own Kurdish traditions and revolutionary experience. Now, Kurdish revolutionaries have taken on task of constructing a new social science that I will be speaking on more tomorrow, antagonistic to knowledge structures of capitalist modernity. Those involved in collective projects of sociology of freedom and genealogy, science of women, have begun to reconstruct stone by stone the institutions which used to unite people in struggles. And in the global north, even the United States, there are many solidarity projects confronting COVID-19 pandemic and other calamities where mutual aid has emerged as a key phrase used by activists and mainstream journalists and even by the police. The police in Oakland, close to where I live, always calls for mutual aid when it needs to do something. So, when the book Mutual Aid, The Factor of Evolution, was released in 1902, there were few social scientists, or few scientists in general, courageous enough to challenge the idea that capitalism, nationalism, the state were rooted in human nature. The idea that the authority of states is somehow inviolable. But I think that the world is moving along. We live in a different time, in a different context. And there are people now, scholars, social scientists, historians, who will probably disagree with me on this. I think that some of them are well paid to write and think the way that they do. Others are probably nostalgic for state socialism and for other notions that we in this part of the world have to live through, unfortunately. And I think that we should go back to Kropotkin, that we should go back to this idea that the only alternative to capitalist barbarism is socialism based on mutual aid. Socialism that is a product, as this simple traveler, great geographer, never ceased to remind us of tendencies of mutual aid that are always apparent in the society and that are always, in some sense, imminent in the present. So I started this talk that I'm going to finish now by mentioning my grandfather, Konstantin. There's something by Goethe where he says that you can only inherit something from your parents or grandparents if you have earned it yourself. Only then you can truly possess it. And this talk I dedicate to him and to the memory of him, and I hope that I was able to learn from his mistakes and from all the beautiful things that he has done enough to present this talk that was very interesting to me and hopefully of some interest to you. So, thank you so much for coming and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrej, for brilliant and extremely rich lecture. I've learned a lot, and for me this is a perfect complement to the work we have done with Petr and Dan on mutual aid, which was more or less meant to provide certain philosophical engagement with the mutual aid, and this is precisely what was missing in our project, and I can't thank you enough for this brilliant lecture. You not only outlined the history of mutual aid, but you also managed to suggest different view of capitalism and provide this perspective that is based on mutual aid that totally deconstructs also the history of capitalism. So in my view, it's just a wonderful achievement, and I'm just going to open the discussion and we can take questions both from inside of this room as well as the outside of the room. So please, you can manage the discussion by yourself. So please,
any comments? Or questions?
Thank you for this engaging presentation. I have a number of reactions, and I'm sort of limited myself to, I hope, to something. They might not be terribly coherent, but to go back to Jim Scott, you know, he borrows this notion of Zobia from Wilhelm von Steinberg. But I mean, the criticism that has been that have been leveled against this notion is that it's largely a romantic construction. I mean, you know, when you talk about people without history, I mean, how can we talk about that? How can we use that phrase after, you know, Eric Wolf, 1982? And even before that, you know, the Zobia is essentially what Edmund Leach wrote about in Iron Burma. And so you have David Nugent, 1982, publishing this, you know, scathing critique that demonstrates that, in fact, this anarchistic, cyclical political system that Edmund Leach described was, in fact, completely the product of capitalism, of you know, of slavery, of trade in opium, jade, the Opium War, and colonialism. So, I mean, I wish that it were otherwise, but at the same time, do we have, in fact, examples of any part of the world or any peoples that are essentially, you know, not englobed by capitalism? I mean, there, of course, you know, there's gift economies which are alive and well. You know, that's part of my work, actually. But they're always sort of entangled and frequently absorbed by capitalism.
Yes.
So this is one part. The other one is this notion of mutual aid. I'm having trouble placing it. I'm sorry, I haven't read your book about it. You have written a book about it, right?
Yeah, there is one. Yes.
I'm sorry, I will. But so what is it? So you mentioned reciprocity. No, you didn't mention reciprocity. You mentioned. Did you mention reciprocity?
It's an alternative way of thinking about it, mostly coming from Polanyi and the substantive school.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Substantive.
But how does it articulate, for example, with the gift? Because, you know, the gift is full of anxiety and competition, and we know this from Malinowski and Boas via Morse. You know, it's an extremely anxiety sort of permeated with anxiety. I mean, I've seen it firsthand in quite lengthy field work I've conducted in various places, and you know, so it's not a nice sort of. It's not a nice system in the way, and I worry about the notion of mutual aid and the fuzzy and the sort of nice and fuzzy connotation that it has. I'll stop you.
With a good reason. This is always a danger when you have anthropologists in the audience who is going to go against gift. It's absolutely true. I agree with absolutely everything you said. Maybe I would defend a little bit Jim Scott just a teeny bit. I think that my criticism of him is actually that he's too pessimistic, not too optimistic. He is actually careful in the book to distinguish between state spaces and non-state spaces as an absolute. He said, be careful of idealization. There is nothing ideal about these spaces. So I think that he's being, as much as he can, careful there. I mean, my problem with Jim is he never mentions capitalism. He ends up basically parroting parroting is a difficult word to use, but basically coming up with this classical libertarian vibe. He's focused so much on the state that he usually speaks of capitalism in a footnote. And that, to me, is extremely detrimental. It doesn't allow him fully to see everything that you write about. And yes, it's only happened. You didn't mention CIA. That was during the Vietnam War. That was where Air America came from, and all of those collaborations. So yes, that's definitely not a pretty story. Now, are there spaces that are completely outside of the logic of capitalism and the state? My whole point is no. These are contradictory locations in which people are trying to escape to a degree, to create a distance from processes of valorization and regulation, state and market, and they're trying to do that in a way that is contradictory. Maybe the idea of Eric Olin Wright about contradictory class location is helpful here. People do create certain spaces that are to an extent inside and outside, and simultaneously at the same time on the inside and outside of capitalism and the state. And I think this is what exactly this entanglement that we should study. And this is what I think mutual aid as a concept affords us, to actually focus on the entanglement, on the way that processes of mutual aid, again, both refuse, subvert, but also make possible the relationships of capitalism, hierarchy, exploitation, and everything else. That, I think, clears that danger of idealizing mutual aid as something that is just so. And I think that I began by reading the definition of Kropotkin of what mutual aid is: an instinct for solidarity, for cooperation, for creation of human and extra-human cooperative activities. And it exists on basically two levels for Kropotkin. It is a social instinct. It is an instinct that actually makes society possible. Human society is impossible without mutual aid, but also in the processes of practical, everyday communistic practices. And going back to David Graeber, he used to call it everyday communism. And I think this is a good way of thinking about it. He was saying, hey, there is mythic communism. We don't like that very much. That is Marx, that is this idea there's a huge rupture. What Kropotkin is saying basically, although David was always contributing or attributing this to Marcel Mauss, who was his great inspiration, communism is everywhere, all the time. By communism, David was thinking about relationships of mutual aid. Now, Marcel Mauss and gift, it's an interesting, this is the second part of your question, it's an interesting and difficult one. I was always thinking that gift, and I don't know if you would agree with this, entails at least three logics. And again, I'm not original here, I'm following people like Alain Carré who were writing about this. One is hierarchical, absolutely. The other one is based on reciprocity. This is the one that you are describing, that's full of anguish, that's full of out-competing, that's full of competition in many ways. There is the third one, which is Maussian, which is the one of the gift proper. That is the one of altruism and exchange. It's different than mutual aid. I would say that there is a difference between communistic practices of cooperation, that is mutual aid, and the moral relation, that is the gift. So when we speak, when Carré, for example, speaks about this, he speaks about three different logics that are entailed in the way that we think about gift. The hierarchical one, the exchange-related one, and reciprocal one, and the one that is basically communistic, that is open-ended, in which you give something away without the expectation of the return. So I don't know what you think about this way of thinking about gifts.
Jean Carré, is that what you said?
Alain Carré?
Huh?
Alain Carré. Do you know the French school of Mons, the movement against utilitarianism in social sciences?
Yeah.
So they have been developing this idea, which I think is very, very interesting. The communistic, let's use that word, relationship idea of the gift is this third open-ended logic of the gift. When we are thinking about gift not as a property relation, but as a moral principle, which is different than hierarchical logic, and it's different than the logic of reciprocity. So I don't know if that was, if this is something that you have encountered in your work on gift economies, but I think that it's important to distinguish. So let's begin with the end of the table.
Oh, okay, sure. Thank you so much. There's so many things I thought about asking about, but in the end I'm going to ask something which may be me projecting a concern of my own onto what you've said, but I still would be interested to know what you think. And something I've been thinking about a lot recently, maybe if I put it into the idiom you were using, so when you talked about exit, voice and loyalty, right? And certainly you didn't say a great deal about voice, except to talk about it as a kind of defensive, as a kind of we defend our space kind of dynamic.
Well, all three are ways of defending.
Well, yeah, sorry, but all three can work like that. But I suppose that it made me think of a question that I often come up against when we think of this particular way of thinking about everyday communism taking place within spaces and interstices and so on. That things like, the kinds of things that often might be captured with voice that we might talk about in terms of struggle tend to be reduced to questions of kind of defensiveness against the state, rather than the potential for maybe this is ultimately my kind of more old-fashioned Marxism slipping back in, but struggle as transformation in a sense that struggles are not kind of only defensive ways of securing a space, but also ways of part of processes of self-education in their own right, and also of forming our own structures of communist self-government, let's say, or however we want to think of it. And so I suppose my question is really, how do you see that kind of relationship between struggle and the kind of process of the kind of subterranean mutual aid, as it were? I know it's a very big question.
It's a huge question, but I think I agree with you. I think it's a struggle that transforms these spaces. I think the interesting thing about thinking historically about these spaces is to distinguish the kind of possessive hierarchical, let's call them hierarchical ways of organizing before incorporation into the capitalist world economy, and those that come later as ways of state and capital trying to incorporate these spaces, because there's always the struggle also on the level of incorporation, reincorporation, refusal, struggle to somehow co-opt that refusal. Voice is, for example, for the Cossacks, took the place of many wars. For the Zapatistas are organized as an army. Zapatistas are EZLN, right? Ejército Zapatista Liberación Nacional. They have a very strict military structure, and they are fighting right now against a very, very difficult paramilitary warfare, low intensity but very violent. And then finally, Rojava, it's a completely militarized society, so war, voice is very much expressed there. Now, struggle, of course, defines these places and changes them. But for me, in ethnographically dealing with these places, historically dealing with them, the most interesting thing is to try to distinguish what actually comes before. What are the things that they bring into this experience? And what are the things that are actually created and brought in through the struggle against the processes of reincorporation? So I know that this doesn't completely answer your question, but I think that we need to think about these processes of contamination, processes of transformation of relations of mutual aid within these spaces that come as a result of their engagement with the world of capitalism, with the world of states. And that's where Braudel is very immensely useful to me, because to go back to the question of the other comrade, this is exactly what makes it less optimistic, less utopian, and makes it real in a sense that I can appreciate. So does that help to an extent?
Yeah.
Okay. Should we go? Yes.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, first, thanks a lot for the talk. As one of the few anthropologists at this philosophy institute, it's always nice to have some anthropology entering these confines, and I think there's a lot of productive discussion between these fields that doesn't happen often enough. There are a lot of things that are really interesting to me that you raised. I mean, a lot of historical moments close to my heart. The history of Cossacks, and this is one of them. And precisely these contradictory moments, I think, it's fascinating, and really there's a problem, or many problems to be drawn out. I mean, the Ukrainian Cossacks, in different ways, but ran into very similar. They made similar. What do you call it? Strategic
choices.
Loyalty, which, depending on whose version of the history you tell, turned out badly for one side or the other. But the thing I really wanted to ask about was, well, this question of the inside and outside, which I think is a really important theoretical question. I remember, I was at the University of Chicago after Terry Turner was formerly there but no longer living there, but there were always debates about like whether you can use Marx to talk about these primitive societies, and Moishe Postone was always, no, there's no Marx outside of capitalism, and now there's nothing outside of capitalism. So there are no kind of interstices.
These were such famous debates. I wish there are recordings of Postone versus Turner debates.
Yeah, it just became a thing of folklore, really. But I mean, where this kind of led to me, and I'll sort of take this through not so most, because thinking about this, what I find the most fascinating and probably the most problematic part of Moses' book on the gift is the last chapter, where after he spends the whole book talking about how potentially violent and problematic and how much hierarchy is involved in gift giving, then he says, but we should give more gifts, and he says, and the state should be the one giving gifts back to the workers who have been giving. And so he brings the gift economy into the state basically as an argument for kind of social democracy, is the way it's presented. But it just makes me think of, the way I try to approach this is to think of how each social system creates its own inside and outside as a constituent part of the system. So I think this is maybe part of what you're saying.
Yes.
Something, when you say that mutual aid is a part of it, is necessary to capitalism even when it's outside of capitalism. So the long way of getting to my question was, is the mutually constitutive outside of the state different from the outside of capitalism? Like, can we? Is it possible in the same way that we create this everyday communism that capitalism lives off of, but also exploits, but also maybe can be expanded? Does this state also, in some way, is the social democratic sort of welfare state a kind of way of the state using everyday gift communism to constitute itself? I haven't figured that out for myself.
Yeah, I think that's what Frances Fox Piven writes about when she talks about regulating the poor or whatever. Frances Fox Piven, book Regulating the Poor, it's kind of a classic of American, at least, sociology. When she talks exactly about this, speaks exactly about this topic. I will go to the laziest, but I think most responsible answer, which is it really depends on research. You know, theory is, and I appreciate good theory, but without social science, without historical research, without ethnography, we can't actually talk about these things with some sort of great clarity. And you might be surprised, but I'm actually much more closer to Moishe Postone than I am to Terry Turner. I am a historical materialist who believes in, who uses value form analysis. So actually, what I like about Terry Turner is thinking about the societies and production before capitalism. I do agree with Moishe Postone that transhistorical generalizations of Marx are not particularly useful. So this was always my disagreement with David Graeber, who was always a little bit more Turnerian, and I was a little bit more Marxist in that sense. Now, again, back to your question, I think that it really depends. It really depends on the research. It depends on what we find in Cossack spaces. What did you say that your research was on?
My research
You mentioned Cossacks.
That's a line of my research that I gave up long ago, but now I look at Slovakia and the Czech Republic.
Okay, so tricky. Okay. But yes, it really depends on how do we think, how do we study this. Most of my recent studies were about prisoners. And it was just fascinating. I studied and wrote, I did many interviews with people in Turkish prisons, in formerly Irish prisons, former IRA soldiers, but especially with the American prisoners in what is called the SHU or the Supermax prisons, the isolation units, and I was trying to understand the notion of prison communism. And it's a fascinating notion, and you're probably familiar with it. Ginsberg names it, I think, first. He speaks about prison communism and relationships of mutual aid within prisons, and then the struggle of the prisons who circulate this knowledge, and police circulates this knowledge between them, of how to create an architecture that's going to prevent prison communism from actually appearing. And I was using a lot of Goffman, and you know, one of the things that Goffman writes about is this idea of how does it call it? There's a term, stripping. And I was interviewing many of the prisoners who told me basically I would give them Foucault to read and I would give them Goffman. They hated Foucault. It's really interesting that absolutely visceral hatred of Foucault, of prisoners, of actual prisoners, is very interesting. But they loved Goffman, and they said that stripping, the process of collective invention of identity, once you are stripped of your previous identity, creates the possibility of actually thinking and assuming a sense of collectivity that did not exist there before. And I think there is something interesting there to look into. So you are stripped of your identity as individual consumer, member of the gang, what have you, petty criminal. And then within the confines of the prison, and even in this isolation, which is the last place that I expected to find this, you see people who are using, and this also militates against Agamben and the notion of bare life as this pessimistic thing that denies agency. You see people using bare life and conditions of bare life to actually create a sense of collective identity that is extremely militant, and it is extremely, in that sense, emancipatory in potential, right? So there are many things that can come into this line of research, and I think actually the work that I've done in the book on the prisons, book is Living at the Edges of Capitalism, Adventures in Exile and Mutual Aid, co-authored with Dennis O'Hearn, who is the official biographer of Bobby Sands, so he knows a lot about the Irish conditions. And what we were able to find out there is that this incredible struggle that is transforming truly the way that prison communism works in these cases is something that exists in the very heart of capitalism. I mean, they're prisoners, but also in the context of neoliberal world economy. You don't understand the prison really if you remove capitalism and more systemic consideration of how economy now is being organized, and especially in the United States, say, where you have demand for black labor completely subsiding in a certain sense. And you have prisons being used as warehouses, where young black people are being warehoused. They're not non-profit or what they call profit industrial complex. They're not used, as many vulgar Marxists still believe, in order to make money and create profit. If they do, it's incidental. They actually exist in order to remove dangerous class of subproletarians from the streets. So this, I think, is really interesting. Once they enter the prison, they create, not always, but in some important cases, a very different kind of collective identity. Inside, outside, where are they exactly in this? I was mentioning the book by Karina Biondi, which is called Sharing This Walk, a beautiful ethnographic Deleuzian study of Brazilian prisons, which makes an interesting Clastrian analysis and Deleuzian analysis of the inside-outside question that you ask about. All of this is a very long answer to say that I don't really know before doing the research and before doing ethnography. But I think as an intellectual project that fascinates me is exactly the entanglement. To what extent mutual aid constrains capitalism and hierarchy, to what extent it actually supports it The discovery of these contradictory substantive activities in which, say, the Zapatistas are actually participating in the world market and commodity trades by producing coffee and selling coffee, and at the same time using that money in order to support women's emancipation, women's cooperatives, to send the money to Kouba or to Electric or to many other places, and examples of mutual aid and solidarity has been really interesting. And in terms of Marcel Mauss, again, total protestation, and I think his ethnographic lectures are more interesting to me than gifts. I'm not a Maussian expert in any way, but I think that this idea, what he describes, which actually comes close to communism, is very interesting, but it is mostly in his lectures, more so than in the gift. And as far as his political orientation, as far as I know, he was a cooperativist. He was mostly a sort of a Proudhonian, not completely Proudhonian, but he definitely wasn't an anarchist of any kind. And his belief in gift economy, in that sense, I'm not entirely surprised that it contains those elements. However, the Mauss group in France have been, what was the name of the book that they published in English? Something about the hidden gift or the world of the gift. I think is very interesting when they speak that the gift is kind of the scandal of capitalism, because it's something that is completely undermined, unacknowledged, something that capitalism does not speak about, and in a certain sense it's the hidden side, I'm paraphrasing, but a hidden face of modernity. Gift as a hidden face of modernity that nobody ever acknowledges. And that was an interesting discussion about Mauss from that perspective, very non-utilitarian perspective. But I suspect you know more about this than I do.
I have a question, but there are some people raising hands there.
There is a question from Petr Urban.
You pick one.
Yeah, so I can see him. You don't have to turn around. But Petr Urban now.
I can see him here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Andrej?
Hi, Peter.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the talk. Very inspiring and rich. I have just one small question, which simply I wonder, what is your view of these recent attempts to redesign cities by some initiatives within, like, it's the European context. You have some examples from European countries, and in the US, I think too, like these attempts to facilitate these structures of mutual aid, of some grassroots activities within the cities, at the very heart of the neoliberal capitalist states, where the local governments do some attempts that are kind of creating, what I would say maybe is an attempt to show an alternative within the current system that is created by the state as such. So what I have been observing, and now I'm in Boston, so here there is a group of people working at the city hall. They have this initiative called New Urban Mechanics, and it is a group of people who come from from social science, so they have like perspectives that are bringing to the local level of government insights inspired by some of the thoughts that you've been discussing. So I just wonder, do you what is your view of that, and especially whether you think that this is simply an attempt that must end up by just being assimilated by the neoliberal in a way that maybe it pretends to create an alternative. It is a sort of making some groups of people within these cities playing these games of mutual aid and these cooperatives and commons but at the same time we are keeping the entire system going. So I wonder, do you think that there is any chance to have these alternatives as parallel to what you have described as the societies that are really outside in terms of your examples of the Zapatistas, and we can go to Pueblir, we can go to some Ubuntu initiatives in Africa. So they are really outside, kind of. But this would be inside, but creating the cracks within the system. Maybe, I don't know. What is your view, please?
I'm not familiar with them, you know. I don't know what they're doing. I'm not familiar with these initiatives. There is a wonderful person and wonderful book, Anna Dinerstein, who is doing, she's a Bostonian, or she's coming from the Open Marxist school, and she writes about utopia of hope. She's using not Adorno but Ernst Bloch to actually theorize these spaces of autonomy, and she speaks about the surplus. Takes this from Bloch. How can we create the excess and surplus, utopian excess, that's not going to be translated into the language of political economy? And to what extent can we actually then think about these spaces as something that's not going to be, again, translated into the grammar of state and capital, but it's going to be resistant, it's going to be that surplus, that excess being produced, that's autonomous, in the key of hope, as she says, is going to be survive out to an extent outside of that logic. And it really depends. It depends on what are their intentions. I think that creating these cracks, to use the term of John Holloway, is always useful. I think that creating these cracks within the texture of capitalism, even if that's not your intention, is very useful. There is a reason why David Harvey, who is very much an anti-capitalist, supports the right to the city, which is very often very much a reformist project. I think there are seeds there, there is potential there. There is something there that, even if it's not a full-blown Lefebvrean total social or self-management, there is something there that maybe escapes, again, produces that surplus and that utopian excess, and exists in that key of hope that it's worth preserving. But again, it has to be researched, it has to be, we have to do some serious study of that, and I'm not familiar with those exact experiences.
Yeah. Thanks. Just a short follow-up. You know, basically the idea behind this is, so if we research that and if we realize that it works in terms of creating these cracks, so then we have examples of maybe a transformation which is possible starting from the level of the local government, like that. If there is no hope that the state government or even the intergovernmental institutions are creating possibility for transformation. So if we see that these alternatives within cities, for example, and their city halls, or you know, the local governments of these communities. So if they are able to create a transformation process or an alternative, so then I think it really brings hope in terms of the possibility to work even within the system, which to an extent I think that, you know, and that's my final just a comment, especially when you were as I understood the framework that you have proposed, is a kind of really, you oppose the alternatives to what is the state, which is always connected to capitalism. But at the same time, I think that it is very important to see all the different types of state that we have had. So there are real differences, big differences in terms of what the state was able to achieve as the state in the real social democratic period, which definitely we are not having now. We are having neoliberalized welfare state, which is actually a huge problem. Yeah, so I'm just pointing to the possibilities of the transformation within, which might be
think it's a great question, you know, and we can actually push it even more. And, you know, I was thinking about Yugoslav self-management as very much a space inside that was also to some extent outside, where there were great experiments of urbanism. Lefebvre actually visited Yugoslavia, and he supported, revolutionary Marxists very much supported the idea of, brilliant geographer, the idea of Yugoslav self-management in architecture and in urbanism. He was very impressed by New Belgrade and all the things that were built in Yugoslavia, in socialist Yugoslavia in those days, and self-managed to an extent. And it was always a very painful topic for me because, you know, I come from Yugoslavia, and I am a fan of socialist self-management, and I am an anarchist, so that contradictory impulse is something that I always had to restrain and to kind of think about and think with. So I agree with you that there is definitely a reformist, revolutionary excess potential there. And Jim Scott writes about this when he writes about Jane Jacobs and local, you know, architectural urbanistic solutions in 2 Cheers for Anarchism, I think is the name of the book. A good chunk of that book is exactly about reformist urbanism as an example for what he calls anarchism. So I think there is something interesting there, definitely. And I'm sorry if I'm not looking at you because I have no idea where you are right now. I'm trying to look into the camera, hoping that's where you are.
Okay.
But yes.
I'm very sorry, I need to remind us of the time limit because there will be another seminar that starts at 4 p.m. and we need to leave the room. So there is time for one more question from Zoom. And maybe Yasar wanted to ask a short question, and we can continue the discussion in pub after we leave. So I guess this is the most pleasant way, but it's unfortunately possible only for those who are here. So Jan, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for the lecture. I have more a theoretical question. You spoke about entanglement, but it seems to me that what is entangled is in fact distributed into quite a dichotomy of good and evil. It's like good on one side, the mutual aid, the solidarity, and the evil on the other side, the capitalism, hierarchy, state. So my question is it really so? And if yes, why it must be so? I'm not a supporter of capitalism and stuff like this, but more like theoretically or even ontologically or social ontologically, I have always problems with this anarchistic views of society and humanity. Thank you.
You're welcome. No, I think it's entangled in a precise sense that it's impure. I don't think that there is purity there. I would stay away from good and bad or good and evil or the, kind of Nietzsche, and I agree with you. I think those binaries are not very helpful. There is nothing necessarily pure about spaces, or say about the Brazilian gangs that are organized according to very Clausian principles of decentralization, of affiliation, that to some extent are very much mutual aidy and have some elements of cooperation, but they're not necessarily good people doing good things. And I suppose you would not like to be on a pirate ship in the 18th century. I definitely wouldn't. There was a direct democratic system. There was also the plank from which you would have to go jump and swim with the sharks. So these places are not exactly spaces of paradise, of utopian promise. They might be, but they're not that by definition. So I agree with you. I don't think that they're evil on one side or good on the other side. I think that entanglement is impurity, and I think, which also not the best term to use, but let's go with Marx and call it contradiction. I think that that contradiction is what we need to study and what is the most interesting thing. To what extent are cooperative practices coexistent with, say, hierarchical practices within the spaces that we call spaces of mutual aid, that I call vibrant interstices following Kropotkin or black holes following Braudel? To what extent we can actually observe these processes in contradiction in the same place without succumbing to this Manichaean logic of evil versus good. Capitalism is definitely a bad thing, if we have to use these terms, but again, there are different kinds of capitalisms, there are different ways that capitalism works, there are different historical periods in which capitalism exists, and there are different ways, and that to me is the most interesting things, of interacting between spaces and processes of mutual aid and spaces and processes of capitalist regulation throughout the existence of what I was referring to as Braudelian world time. The existence of capitalism and capitalist world ecology. This is something that I have to apologize, I did not talk enough about, if at all, which is the problem of nature. And I think that more and more we need to talk about not only capitalist world system, but capitalist world ecology. And Jason Moore and some other people are doing some wonderful work on this, on capitalist world ecology, and the way of thinking exactly about these contradictions, perhaps from a more Marxist perspective, not so much centered on mutual aid, but definitely taking into account impurity, contradiction, and what they call the ecology of care. So it's a bit of a rushed answer because I'm trying to meet the deadline, but hopefully at least somewhat illuminating. Okay.
Yeah, just a short one.
Yeah, very short. And I'm also projecting with my own concerns here.
I'm a Lacanian analyst in training, so project away.
But the examples you drew on, or the models like exilic spaces with this Zoomian, they seem to suggest that the alternative to capitalist structure is another structure. And and this is the subjective concern I'm projecting here, that and I want to bring to your knowledge a book, a volume called Lilies of the Field. That is a collection of ethnographic essays on groups that keep an anti-capitalist stand. They are very marginal, that's what they share. It's from Roma to London prostitutes to Japanese day laborers, etc. And the authors produce an introductory chapter, theoretical chapter, in which they say that the very key aspect of how to keep this anti-capitalist stance is not to create a new structure, because that assumes some permanence, but is the temporal inversion, actually, and the creation of something they call the permanent present. The tendency to extend, to blow time, so that it doesn't develop, so that it doesn't stabilize. And that's actually like notions like fugitivity and escape as an elaborate but non-recognizable, non-surveyable alternatives to capitalism is what I think is like the more close to what ethnographers are now focusing on, not the alternatives in the structural sense as you were looking for.
I agree with the caveat. I mean, I love the temporal inversion, and it's a card-carrying Braudelian. I believe in the plurality of social times, of course, and the way that we need to think temporality seriously. Also believe that we need to revisit Marx, especially in the light of his correspondence with Vera Zasulich, in the way that he thinks about time. I think it's we were not very fair to Marx, because we were not studying the way that he was referring to time, and that he was conceptualizing time at the end of his life, which I think gives us a lot to think about in terms of anachronistic temporality that is different than archaic temporality, and he does make a distinction there that I think is very interesting. But I'm also, yes, but we do need some kind of stability. And I'm trying to remember, not with much success, the term that Agamben uses for this. There's a kind of destabilizing, the possibility to destabilize the system, destitutive power. The term destitutive power as opposed to constitutive power, I think, is very interesting, which means that you have to, and I think this was an anarchist perspective on self-management from the very beginning, create institutions that can always be somehow destabilized in order to be reinvented. And this, I think, every successful experience, including the Zapatistas, if you think about the Zapatistas, who so far have been rather successful in doing this, every time they approached the moment of ossification, they were able to reinvent, to use this dissensus, and to create this disruption that was creative, that created new, not temporal relations, but that, in the language that I was using, renegotiated the loyalty bargain. As a response to the pressures from, you know, the activists, the humanitarians, different NGOs, they created Juntas de Buen Gobierno, a completely new system of direct democratic decision-making, in order to create a different kind of organization that would disrupt the tensions and inequality in the Zapatista territories. So as long as there is this, and Castoriadis was writing about this and many others, as long as there is an institution that allows for, I'm not against it, if it allows for this census, for this destitute, for this moment of disruption that is going to de-ossify something and bring back the creative impulse and bring back that creative temporality that has been temporarily frozen. So I think I like the idea of that you are proposing, or the authors of the book are proposing. I would just be Hakim Bey just died, one of the great theorists of temporary autonomous zones. While I love who coined the term temporary autonomous zone, but while I love the idea of temporary, I also I'm a revolutionary. I like the idea of some kind of stability and some kind of duration that is going to be able to be reinvented creatively, restructured creatively, and again, in spirit of self-management, reinvented democratically.